Something else I often think about is, when, like you said, if people are to be like, oh, what do your parents do? Are your parents okay? And you don't always feel like you're in the mood to be like, oh, it's just my mom. And something that I find myself wondering about is why the reason I don't feel comfortable bringing that up all the time is because I'm aware of making the other person feel uncomfortable. And I'm so focused on not making someone else feel uncomfortable in my presence. And it's a really interesting thing because when we're the people who've experienced this loss, it's interesting that we still are focused on other people's discomfort when really it can be quite comforting to just mention my dad passed away. It's just my mom. And even just saying it brings some comfort.
Have you ever thought about your meaning of life?
What is our purpose here? You're listening to CatharSIS, a podcast about the meaning of life, created by two sisters who are in the field of marriage and family therapy.
Hello, my name is Michal.
And I'm Mayan.
This podcast was created in honor of our dad, who was a hematologist-oncologist, a medical doctor who would always ask everyone and anyone, what is the meaning of life?
It's a personal yet relatable podcast where we interview people and have discussions about the meaning of life, of course, as well as friendships, relationships, love, nostalgia, how to cope with an existential crisis, and normalizing grief and death. Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
We have with us one of my best friends who I met abroad in the Netherlands, Maastricht, back in the day, Kira Sklar, and I asked if she could come onto our show because Kira has such an incredible story and life experience that I feel like a lot of our listeners can learn from. So that is why I asked. Thank you so much for joining us, Kira.
Thank you for having me here. I'm very excited to be here.
So the first question was, how do we know each other? I kind of told our listeners a little bit, but do you have anything to add with that?
Yeah, so I am from Canada. Mayan is from California, and our paths crossed when we both studied abroad in the Netherlands in 2015. We were randomly allocated to living in rooms right next to each other, and we fell into a deep friendship love very quickly and have been able to keep in touch ever since, and we see each other regularly. But it's been a beautiful long distance friendship.
I concur. So Kira is actually she's just finishing up her second year of medical school. And our first question is, what got you interested in pursuing a career in medicine?
I think I've always been very excited and obsessed with understanding people. And that led me to study psychology in my undergrad degree. I was just obsessed with why people do things, why we are the way we are, how did we evolve, how did we come to be like this? It was so fascinating to me. And what sort of sunk in over time was that I was really excited about learning about sort of the biology and anatomy that leads to our behavior, learning that there were biochemical pathways that made us do the things we do was so cool. So I came to med school, committed to studying psychiatry. Now that I've been here and I'm 2 years in, I've become really excited about so many different specialties. I'm not totally wedded to psychiatry anymore. But it's been a journey, and I feel very grateful to be here.
Were there any life experiences that made you think I want to be a medical doctor? Or was it really just the fascination with science?
It was mostly the fascination with science. Shortly before I started, about 8 months before I started med school, my dad passed away quite suddenly. And that, of course, stimulated me to want to understand people and biology and medicine even more.
Yeah, I still can't believe that our dad passed away just 2 years after yours did, and you were only 24. And I feel like our paths have been very similar in different ways, of course, and similar ways.
Something that I've been realizing lately is ever since our dad died 3 months ago, I have felt this push. There was some kind of push, like to get this podcast started. Like I'm starting a PhD program in January in mind body medicine, and which I'm obsessed with. And so I don't know, I'm curious about, what pushes people in general, but even any kind of life experiences that push someone to a decision is very fascinating to me.
That PhD program sounds so interesting. Wow. I can't believe, that it's only been 3 months since your dad passed, also already 3 months, but that you're already making this podcast and honoring his life in such a beautiful way is really special. But in terms of my push, I had a bit of a funny timeline, you could say. I had wanted to go to med school in Toronto, so University of Toronto. And I found out mid-May that I didn't get in. And I remember on that day, so that was May 8th, I think, May 8th or 9th. And I was thinking to myself, like, oh my God, life can't get any worse. This is so horrible. And then literally 2 days later, my dad passed away, which, I mean, obviously is not funny, but I'm laughing at because the irony is strong, and it really gave me perspective that, not getting into med school the first time I tried is not a big deal. But then having that happen really shortly after, I had this thought to myself, like, I'm just ready to go now. I'm ready to go to med school. I could wait around and apply again and maybe get into school in Canada next year. But schools in Australia were starting in January. I wouldn't have to wait until September. So within, I think, a week or something like that, I submitted my applications to Australian med schools. And I felt, I, of course, had a lot of grief and mourning and all sorts of things to deal with, but it really motivated me to want to do something that I was proud of.
Yeah, totally. I love that. What are you learning currently in school, medical school?
Yeah, so the way it works, we do about every 5 to 8 weeks, we switch from, so we're doing oncology right now, and we've got 4 weeks of oncology. And so the past 2 years have been 8 weeks respiratory medicine, and then however many weeks cardio. Oncology is very cool right now. And then next year, we are full time in the hospital. So this is my last block, sort of doing lectures and having that more academic side.
Oncology sounds so cool. Our dad was an oncologist, as you know. Is there anything that is resonating with you about that block, or?
So far, I'm loving it. We're only 1 week in, so I don't have too much to say, but I've been really excited about it. And with my history of loving psychology, loving connecting with people in deep and meaningful ways, I really see oncology as a career where you get to do all of that. It, of course, is more focused on, your physical well-being, but your mental well-being undergoing cancer treatment is such a big part of it. So I've been quite inspired hearing from the lecturers so far who talk about how, you really personalize it to your patient. And of course, I've been thinking about the things you've told me about your dad and how he loved to sit down and ask people, what's the meaning of life? And it seemed like he had a really beautiful way of connecting with his patients. And that's definitely something that I'd like to see myself doing someday.
I love that. I work with cancer patients as a marriage and family therapist, so it's so meaningful for me. I mean, I know that for our dad, it was truly special for him to walk the path with someone who is just going through such a life-altering event that makes them question everything in their lives. And I think for him, being with people who are questioning all of that and kind of just being a witness in many ways to their experience gave him meaning and kind of helped him find direction in how to live his life. And I'm understanding it on so many levels now, just being in, the therapy room and having these deep discussions with cancer patients and their loved ones, what comes up for them. So I think that's so special that you're touched by that as well.
Yeah, totally. Does that make you feel connected to your dad in some way, being able to connect with patients with cancer?
Big time. I feel connected to him every day. It's now even more so because I feel like I'm understanding him in a different way.
That's so nice. Something that I have really grown to love is those little ways that I feel connected to my dad. And my dad, people often described him as this larger than life character. You'd walk into a room and he just knew how to talk to everyone and connect with everyone. And he was so funny and charming and lovable. I have moments where he just loved the world so much. We'd go for a walk and he'd be like, wow, can you believe this? And we'd be walking down the street that we walk down every day for our whole life. And something that I've noticed is when I have moments where I'll be really excited about a very trivial thing, I'll feel really strongly connected to him. And I love that.
I love that.
It's beautiful.
This podcast is all about normalizing grief and death. What advice would you give someone who doesn't know how to approach the subject? I know this is something we've been talking about. If anyone asks questions about our dad, why is saying, oh, our dad's passed, why does it make the other person so uncomfortable if it's such a normal thing or if it's such a common thing?
I know. I wonder that a lot. Something else I often think about is, when, like you said, if people are to be like, oh, what do your parents do? Are your parents okay? And you don't always feel like you're in the mood to be like, oh, it's just my mom. And something that I find myself wondering about is why the reason I don't feel comfortable bringing that up all the time is because I'm aware of making the other person feel uncomfortable. And I'm so focused on not making someone else feel uncomfortable in my presence. And it's a really interesting thing because when we're the people who've experienced this loss, it's interesting that we still are focused on other people's discomfort when really it can be quite comforting to just mention, my dad passed away, it's just my mom. And even just saying it brings some comfort, I think. So that's been something I've been trying to push myself to be more open about. In terms of giving advice to people who don't know how to talk about death. And I love so much that you have this podcast because people really don't know how to talk about death. I was really vocal giving my friends advice in the early days after my dad passed. I was really letting people know what I needed. And if my close friends weren't delivering, I was telling them. And something I would say is, look, I know, I totally understand. I didn't know how to talk about death either before I experienced a deep loss. But you can just tell me you don't know what to say. If I would rather hear, I'm thinking of you, I don't know what to say, than hear nothing and think your friend is not there. Because when you're going through something so dark and meaningful, you really just want to know that people are with you, holding your hand, virtually, whatever. You want to know you have people.
Yeah, that's so beautifully articulated and really resonating.
You were like my coach while I was my first week. You were just like, you're probably going to expect this, but I don't know because everyone's different. Like you just you gave me a play-by-play.
Coach.
Yeah, you were my coach. And yeah, no, I think something that I really admire is that the trauma that you did face, it pushed you to build and it pushed you to persevere on yourself, and it's kind of like you're in flight or fight. I mean, also this is speaking for me, it's like you're in flight or fight mode. You gotta, everyone reacts to a death differently, especially death of a loved one, but I kind of want to go a little bit deeper. What did losing your dad, what was the impact that it had on you and your family? Did it make you look at the world differently? Did it make you look at relationships differently?
Yeah, definitely. I'll go a bit deeper and talk a bit about how my dad died. So I described already my dad was this boisterous, lovable, larger than life character. He loved the world. He loved his family so much. As a biased person, I believe that my dad loved me more than anyone has loved anyone, loved me and my sisters. And about 3 years before his death, so towards the end of 2015, I was on exchange at this time. I remember coming home from exchange and my mom telling me, Dad hasn't been sleeping so well lately. And that's what we knew at the beginning. And what quickly unfolded from not sleeping, or not sleeping being the first symptom, was a deep, dark depression that was pretty unrelenting. Now, I was a psychology student at the time. My family has always been quite open about mental health and talking about problems and going to therapy if you need it or if you want it. So it wasn't a secret or something we were ashamed of, like I know it can be for some people, and that's really hard. But what was really challenging was that for 3 years, my dad tried every single treatment that was out there. He was on so many antidepressants that he was keeping a multi-page binder of, all the drug changes. And my mom became sort of his organizer in that way. And he tried ECT and he tried CBT and he tried mindfulness-based therapy and he tried countless other things. He was in and out of hospital a few times. And when he ultimately died, he was in the hospital at the time. He had self-admitted because he said he didn't feel safe at home and took his own life in the hospital. So that way of losing someone presents a very unique challenge on top of losing someone you love so deeply. It's all of a sudden you have to become an advocate. And while I've always been passionate about mental health and was an advocate in some way, I was never personally involved. So while I still wanted to smash stigma and talk about it and let people know that dying by suicide is analogous to dying by any other chronic illness, there was nothing selfish about it. There was nothing, I don't think it was a choice for him. I think it was a result of his chronic illness. Not everyone in my life or not everyone in the world is caught up to that. And I understand that. So that's been a really hard thing, sort of wanting to still be an advocate, but also needing to protect myself, because if someone argues with me on suicide loss, that's really personal for me. And it's not the same as, having an academic argument. This affects me deeply.
Yeah. So I'm curious, with your you have almost 2 years of medical school under your belt, medical knowledge. When I know you said that you were originally interested in psychiatry, now you're you don't know, but at least looking at it from the medical knowledge lens, how would you explain that mental illness is equated to it's a chronic illness and that you can look at it through a biochemical lens? Is there a way to educate society in a way where we're looking at it from a medical lens so that it can be taken as seriously as it should be, right? And if so, what are some ways that someone maybe listening on this podcast who maybe has an interest in science or would be receptive to an explanation like this? Do you think that it's helpful to tell someone, you know what, it's medical and it's chemical?
Yeah, that is sort of that's my way in with people who I feel like haven't been exposed to these topics before. It's not just I think, there's evidence that depression and other mental illnesses are biochemical and inflammatory. There's a lot going on when you look at research with people with depression or even talk to people with depression. It's not like everyone has this story of their life falling apart and then they're depressed. It's, that happens sometimes, but in general, it's an interaction of genes. Some people are predisposed to getting mental illness, and there's a lot of genetic research in that area, of environment. So maybe if you're predisposed, but nothing ever happens that stresses you, you won't end up getting depressed. And so many other things, people who do have chronic inflammatory illnesses like autoimmune disease tend to have more depression than people without. And so many things that suggest that having your body experience a sense of inflammation, infection, your body and your brain are connected. So it really is a biological thing. And I guess bottom line is it's very complex. So there are a lot of things that have to happen together in order to get a mental illness. And of course, the social experiences you have, socioeconomic status, racial status, so many things come into play. But it's very complicated, and it's not just about, not being strong enough to pull yourself together or anything like that, any of the stigmatizing attitudes that unfortunately are still out there.
I also want to just thank you so much for being vulnerable with us and sharing your story. I know that these stories are not easy to share, and I really admire your will to want to educate people. And I also know that can be a frustrating thing. Totally, yeah. Like, it's also not, your job to educate people. Right. And at the same time, people need to be educated, and it's frustrating. It's a frustrating thing.
Just to add to what Mayani's saying, it is so admirable to hear you share such a story with us, such a story that I know is so personal. And at the same time, I think at the cancer center that I work at, we talk a lot about how sharing your story is healing. I actually have a book right now that I recommend to a lot of people. It's called Healing from Within. And it's this idea of like sharing your story can really help with healing. And it's not just for yourself, but the person listening. Like, I can say for myself, hearing you share that story is healing for me with my own stuff, with whatever in life. And I can only imagine how many people listening would feel inspired, like, wow, I should be more vocal, at least even if it's to themselves,
Thank you. I mean, I definitely feel that sharing my story gives me power. What I think my dad's story does also is when I describe him the way he was, this like happy, bubbly, lovable person who had everything going for him, it helps shed light on the non-discriminatory nature of depression. While, of course, people experiencing stressful life events are more at risk for depression, that doesn't mean they're the only people who get it. Really, none of us are immune. And that's why talking about mental health is for everyone.
Totally. 100%. Do you know about epigenetics?
You betcha.
I am obsessed with epigenetics. I guess that's the part that I kind of geek out about, is sharing your story. Like, wow, just sharing your story could be so healing.
I think not only is it healing, but it also destigmatizes what is going on and what we are faced. And that's like, I feel like I bring 12-step up all the time, but that's what 12-step programs are. It's sharing your story to help with community. You're not alone. And what's really interesting, dying by suicide is another common way of death, another common way of exiting, yet there is a lot of stigma around it, and for some reason there's a lot of shame, especially in the past. Like, people would keep it a secret. Oh, like we have to say he died from a sickness. Like, people wouldn't flat out say this is what happened. And I feel like it's interesting, and I'm so curious why there is so much shame and why there is so much stigma. And I'm also curious about the fact of the people that I have personally heard in my life, stories that I've heard, people that died by suicide. A lot of their family members and their friends are like, I had no idea. you and your family and your dad was so upfront and, vocal about what he was going through. I think it is extremely powerful that your dad was so vocal on his journey and kind of took you all on this journey with him. I'm still amazed that you got through school. How did you, during those 3 years of him battling that, how did you go through school, and how are you a human?
Well, first of all, in terms of talking about it, I guess I did miss a part of the story that me talking about my dad's story started with my dad talking about his story. My dad was a successful businessman. He started his own market research company that is still doing very well in Canada. And I guess maybe 1 year into his illness, he had won a Lifetime Achievement Award in the marketing world. It was like a Marketing Hall of Legends, something like that. And he was such a good speaker. He was so good at talking to people. He typically he had to do an acceptance speech. He typically would have, spent a couple of minutes, maybe jot down some points, get up there and just talk. And he was severely depressed. He was not well. He had written this whole speech, word for word, and practiced to my mom over and over and over again leading up to the event. He ended up presenting the speech. And, to get the award, he needed to present the speech. And there had been some talk, should I even accept this award? I don't know if I can do that. He got up there, he presented his acceptance speech. And in that speech, to a hall full of CEO type people and people in the business world where that's not necessarily talked about all the time, my dad talked about his depression. He said, some of you might know, for the last year, I've been experiencing this. This is I remember that he used the words, insidious disease that needs more attention. And starting there is when, my dad was just being honest, but all of a sudden these people were coming out of the woodwork to be like, thank you for talking about that. I've experienced depression and I've never told anyone. Or thank you for being so open. I've learned so much from you. Or if someone like you can get depressed, it really makes me realize anyone could be. I need to pay more attention to this. And he started that for our family, at least. And when he ended up dying in 2018, it was without a question that when we put a obituary out in the paper, we were going to say how he died. And from that, the response also, we got an anonymous letter in the mail, just someone saying, I was reading the newspaper and I thought this and I saw this, and I just want you to know that you're changing people's lives by being open about this. And again, people that my mom had known for decades coming through saying, I've experienced really severe depression, or someone saying, I've experienced severe depression and also this chronic illness. And let me tell you, my depression was so much more and I've never told anyone. And it was just the power that we felt in talking about it, just one, made me feel so much less alone. You don't hear about suicide deaths, so you think it doesn't happen. But when you talk about it, you have people coming out, happened to me, happened to me, happened to me. And it makes you feel less alone. It's of course horrible that it is so common, and we need to talk about it more. So the people who do feel stigma and don't get the treatment they need or are afraid to ask for the treatment they need feel more comfortable. That shouldn't be a problem, that people aren't getting the treatment they need. And that's on all of us as society to talk about this more. I forget what your question was.
I'm just mesmerized by everything you're saying. Just keep going.
I find it incredible, Kira, that your dad was so vocal in his speech, and that your family learned that as well, to be vocal and say, like, we are not going to hold this stigma and shame against us. We are going to talk about this because this is an important thing to talk about, because it is horribly common. And why are we going to hide the truth when hiding the truth actually does more damage than good? And I tell that to parents all the time. I work with children, and a lot of parents think like, oh, they're only 2, or oh, like, it's kids need to know things. People need to know things. People need to know
from a young age.
Yeah, we need to know things from a young age, and that's one of the ways is teaching your kids about these things and normalizing things.
And that's a good way, because by the time you get to an adult, you have so much crap you have to unlearn that if you can start them early, we just grow up thinking this is a sad way to die because death is always sad. It's a result of a chronic illness. Something that I feel was really important for me, or something I feel so grateful about, is so I guess I was only in my undergrad for 1 year while my dad was sick. The next 2 years of his illness, I was living at home with him and with my parents. I was also working at a children's hospital in psychiatry research. So everyone around me at work was very in tune with mental health. And when my dad died, or, instances before where he was quite sick and I was upset, I always felt so supported by work. That's something that I'll forever feel grateful about. I know that for some people, they have to go back to work and no one says anything. It's like, ooh, death is scary. Like, what if I make them upset? I won't say anything. And that can feel really lonely. So it shouldn't just be groups of psychiatrists and psychologists where we talk about these things. But if anyone listening, or anyone listening who has experienced a loss like this and isn't ready to talk about it, then I can tell you that if you know anyone who's a psychologist or a psychiatrist, if you have access to see a mental health counselor yourself, it's a really safe place to start, and it feels good.
Yeah, it does. I wanted to share it with you in conversation. The first funeral I attended, I was in middle school, and it was my really good friend at the time. Her sister had died by suicide. And I remember being at the funeral and, just kind of going through the motions and, obviously like being there with my friend, but I don't remember any conversations about it. I don't remember anything. Like, there was no education around it. It was very like hush hush. So, to have that experience, and then obviously to go through, I worked on a suicide hotline in college, which really taught me a lot about mental illness in general, but it taught me a lot about people who are depressed, and then just the different levels that you can experience, and that there are different levels, and how to be a supportive friend to someone. It's just me thinking like, wow, in 20 years, I see now there's a slow upward trend of education, but it's like, come on, why is it taking so long? Normalize it already.
It's true. Yeah. And it really is a shame, because like you said, and like your book talks about, talking about something that's had such a profound impact on you really does help with the healing. And I can only imagine how much harder this process would be if I wasn't able to talk about it.
On that note, Kira, how do you cope? How do you cope during times of uncertainty?
So many things. Primarily my deep and meaningful friendships. I also had an amazing therapist I was seeing in Toronto before I moved. I had already been seeing her weekly while my dad was sick. That I was in a very fortunate position where I already had a relationship with a therapist when he died. She was amazing in helping me process the grief, but also in coming up with coping strategies for how to deal with different people who didn't know how to support me the way I needed. And she helped me find my voice in advocating for what I needed with my friends, telling my friends what I needed and when I wasn't getting it and how I could get it, and offering suggestions, because I know that being there for someone who's grieving is really hard and really scary, and you have this pressure where you want to say something to make them better. And of course, nothing you say is going to make them feel better. It's what they've experienced is terrible. And I think when it all started, my therapist helped me see that I was expecting too much for all my friends to just know how to be there for me right away. But being able to talk about it and being lucky enough to have friends who were so receptive and really just wanted to be there for me. Mayan especially was, she was across the continent, but with such a strong support. Yeah, friends are amazing. And if you feel like your friends aren't giving you exactly what you need, they want to give you what you need. So tell them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's so important to be able to tell your friends, to tell the people you love, hey, this is what I need, and this is how you can show up for me right now.
Yeah, I think what also my therapist helped me with, and I was moving to Australia so early on in this grief healing journey, that something I was really nervous about was like, I get there and then like, how do I tell people? And I had this sort of incorrect belief that like everyone needed to know right away. How could I get to know people without them knowing this about me? And we had sort of talked through different scenarios or figured out why it was that I felt like I needed everyone to know right away. And then when I got here, maybe there was one or two people where, I was like, okay, gotta tell you. And then I realized that didn't feel that right. And so I've sort of modified and learned this new experience where, as I've been meeting so many people, setting up a new life in a new continent, slowly figuring out what works for me in terms of disclosing and continuing to make meaningful friendships, but not, over disclosing too early.
I can totally relate to that. After our dad died, I was just like, my dad died, pass it on. Like, I wanted everyone to know that he died so I wouldn't have to repeat the story, and I wouldn't have to keep talking about it. Like, I wanted the message to just spread like a wildfire.
Yeah, I totally relate to that. And that was something that was so, I don't know, I guess before I moved, you posted on Instagram, or I called Mayan and like, I was like, you spread the word in our shared network. And then I, called my friend Montana and was like, you spread the word in our shared network. And I wanted to just like tell as few people as possible, but make it an announcement that just everyone could know I got it over with. Because those first conversations were horrible, as I'm sure you guys can relate to. And then since moving here, it's been this new thing where I'm like, well, now I'm meeting people. They weren't around during the time. So it's definitely a new process.
Yeah, no, and Kira, you've taught me so much about mental health before I even got into this field. And I admire your knowledge and wisdom, and I love how you teach. I feel like you teach people around you. And because you taught me, I feel like you do that also with other people. And I think that's such an important quality in somebody. And through your teachings, you help people learn so then they can teach others. And through that, the world, at least the small circle here, and then it goes farther and farther, it becomes a better place, a more knowledgeable place. And I really do value education. I think that is a big method to destigmatize, and it's kind of like the antidote for fear in that way.
This is reminding me of the webinar that I went to this past Tuesday. So David Kessler, do you know him? Do you know of him? So, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, like the stages of grief. David Kessler has worked with her before, and he came up with like the 6th stage of grief, which is finding meaning. So he has a book called The 6th Stage of Grief, Finding Meaning. And so the webinar was by him and this rabbi, and it was on grief and grieving. And one of the metaphors that they gave, it really stuck with me. And I feel like I've been talking about it ever since, but it was the metaphor of grief, not being a linear process, but the metaphor had to do with you're in an ocean and a wave is coming at you. You're not gonna stay standing. You standing there isn't gonna make the wave like somehow not knock you over. It's gonna knock you over. So you have to go with it. Go with the wave. However you do that, and then you can stand up after the wave passed. And that I think a lot about that, because grief, whether it's a death of a loved one, whether it's a death of an old life you knew, career transitions, or, getting diagnosed with a life-threatening illness, whatever it is, I think it's important to really understand that it's okay to go through the different waves of grief. And some days you're going to feel angry, and maybe you'll snap at your friend because they didn't say the right thing. And hopefully they'll forgive you for that. I think they will, and then you're also going to have days where you're maybe not as sensitive. And maybe you're going to have days where you're like, okay, today I can find the meaning. Today I can find meaning, like you were saying about your dad being this larger than life person, and just enjoying the street that you were always walking on. So it made me think like, okay, for example, this podcast, there's a lot of meaning in it for me. My dad's legacy gets to be continued. His legacy of asking people right off the bat after hello, how are you? My name is, so and so. What's the meaning of life? And at the same time, I'm in this understanding of it's okay to not feel like you can find meaning every day. You don't have to find meaning every day. You can go through the motions. And they also talked about the different stages of grief. So it's like there's anticipatory grief, and then there's the actual death. And then if the death is unexpected, then there's like an early phase of grief. And then there's the early stage of grief, which is 2 years, they say. So I don't know. It's something I'm realizing too, is you can have this structured like 2-year early grief. And I think, but it's different for everyone, just from people I've been talking to, and it's different for everyone. And it's really special to me to hear part of how you've been dealing with it and how you've approached it. And I mean, just so beautiful that your family was very vocal from the beginning, and that your dad was very vocal about it, and it's just open and honest. And that's what I think these discussions are too. I know that they can be uncomfortable for some people, but I would much rather have an open and honest discussion.
Yeah.
I agree. I think you definitely can take baby steps to start. And how that's manifested for me since moving to Australia and meeting new people in my program, there's 250 people in our cohort, and I'm not going to tell everyone the whole story. Mm-hmm. So the baby step is, the first time they bring up my parents, maybe one day I'll feel comfortable saying, oh, it's just my mom at home. Or, and then maybe the next time I'll mention my dad passed away. And then when I feel really comfortable, I can tell the whole story. And those baby steps are okay. And I really like what you said, Michal, about the whole, you don't have to find meaning every day. And that's a message that I've really taken to heart recently. I mentioned, I came to med school wanting to do psychiatry, and obviously losing my dad to depression, I felt this personal urge. I have to dedicate my life to mental illness. I have to do psychiatry. I have to honor my dad this way. And part of why I've sort of become more drawn to different specialties is I think it would be really hard to face head on my deepest, darkest trauma every day for the rest of my life. And I think while that would be a wonderful way to find meaning, and maybe one day I will feel like that is the path I want to take, I think just living with the trauma I experienced every day and coping with it is enough, that I don't necessarily have to dedicate my life to it in that way.
So after all of this, Kira, what is your perception about death?
Yeah, interesting question. I think my perception about death is evolving. I know when my dad first died, after seeing him in such psychological anguish for 3 years, I just, wanted to know he was at peace. And I remember, like, on my lunch break at work, Googling what happens after you die. And I just needed to make sense of it and understand it. And I remember coming across, it's like physics or chemistry theory that's like matter cannot be created or destroyed. And so consciousness surely is the same thing. You can't destroy matter. You can't destroy consciousness. And I was sort of like running away with this. I'm like, okay, his consciousness is out there somewhere. Now that it's been more time, I'm not really sure what I believe. I think that he's at peace in whatever way that looks like for him. Yeah, I don't know. One of those things that...
Yeah. I'm curious if your family ever kind of brought, if death was a subject you guys talked about growing up, or it's not like a common subject.
Not that I can recall. Yeah, I don't know. My grandparents all passed away when I was fairly young. And, we all went to the funeral, went to Shiva, shared our memories. The beautiful thing about death in Judaism is that Shiva is such a beautiful thing. You're just forced together with people you love to share memories. I love that. I don't remember having deep conversations about it.
Yeah.
What made you ask that question?
I don't know, just because like everyone kind of deals with death in their own way. And I feel like our dad, he bought grave plots. He was like preparing for...
My parents did too ages ago. And it made it quite easy for my mom. I mean, it's always easy.
Yeah.
No, it's very interesting that like we live this life knowing about the thing, death.
The thing.
And I don't know, it's like we prepare for it, like we mentally prepare for it, we don't prepare for it. Like there's just so many things. I also what came to mind with your wave analogy, Michali, is the whack-a-mole analogy that you told me, Kira. Do you want to say it?
Yeah. This was my favorite analogy. So my therapist in Toronto told me, she used this analogy that grief is like whack-a-mole. So if you can imagine that game where like you've got like moles popping up at different times all over the place, you have to whack them. That's really like the different emotions you experience in grief, especially in the early days. You're kind of like walking around, you feel okay, and then like boom, anxiety, and then goes away, and then you're like, oh, that was a lot, and then like boom, sadness, and just all these emotions coming up all over the place. You feel like you've got no control over it. That really resonated with me. Now I think that it's been, I guess, 2.5 years. I definitely relate with the wave thing more. Most of the time, I can live my life. Every once in a while, a strong wave comes. I've developed better coping skills that they don't knock me down anymore the way they used to. Sometimes a really strong one will come. We'll all need to, take a couple breaths. Yeah, it's been interesting to see it evolve.
Thank you so much for taking us on your journey with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been, I support everything you guys do. I love this. I love your Instagram page. I'm loving the podcast so far. I'm very excited to be a part of it. And like we talked about, having a place to tell my story is always special.
Yeah. And Kira, because this podcast is about the meaning of life, are you able to tell our listeners what your meaning of life is?
Yeah. I will start by saying I've never answered this question before. You really give the big questions. I think how I find meaning in life, or my meaning of life, is deep, meaningful relationships. And that's with friendships, with my partner, with my family, talking about deep and meaningful things. That also includes my relationship with myself. Means, doing my own self-work with therapy, with self-care, with finding things I'm passionate about so that I can reciprocate in my deep, meaningful relationships and, meet people where they are, have a equal give and take. And yeah, I think life is about, one of the beautiful things about life is all the people you get to connect with in this journey.
Yeah.
We're honored for you to share your story. I think it's such an important one, and the message is so valuable for listeners. So thank you so much, Kira.
Thank you so much.
In a world where I'm a drop in the ocean, an Israeli, American, whatever, in France, to be completely happy and satisfied in my environment, all I need is one friend. 2 friends, it's a luxury. Okay, the ultimate friend is the one you open up your soul to, the one you share with, the one who actually gives you the full reaffirmation that you thirst for. Okay, we all do that. Okay, we all have the thirst for reaffirmation.